And we'll kick off our conversation with Kirk Jowers. Some of us, myself included, I'll be very candid, myself included, had high hopes that perhaps the Republicans would look at a couple of things. One, making the caucus system a little more open and inviting for everyone, giving people who maybe did not have that very, very small window available maybe a little more flexibility so they could feel that they had a shot at participating in this most important and extremely powerful one little slice moment in time. That did not happen. And we also, myself and others, had hoped that we would not go back to the 70% threshold that we had a decade or so ago. In other words, in order to get a clean sweep at the convention, to avoid a primary and everything else, you had to hit 70%. Otherwise, there would be a primary, and we used to have more primaries. Now it is easier at a 60% threshold for people to get a clean sweep, avoid a primary, and as Representative Craig Powell, Republican from up in the Heber Valley area, said, that, along with many other factors, makes the caucus night the real election night in the state of Utah. That's the real election day. Whenever the Republicans, and in a rare case, most of the races, once a Republican has gained the nomination, what happens in November, in many, many cases, not all, but in many cases, you know it and I know it, the general election is more of just kind of a confirmation of what happened at the convention. We, myself and others, had hoped that we'd at least go to the 66 2/3, in other words, the supermajority level, that it takes back in Washington to do some very significant things, that it takes to change the Constitution of the United States, that it takes to do a lot of things in our society to go to 2/3 majority. If 2/3 majority think that this is the guy or gal, then more power to them. Fine, we don't need a primary, got it, and we'll just move on to the general election. Most of us felt that this was a real good compromise. 77%, much more than a super majority of people who were polled. And this is a conversation that I had just last week with Thomas Wright, the outgoing chairman of the party. 77% felt, or strongly felt, that the party would be better served if we went back to a higher level. But oh, not the delegates, not the delegates. As I've said throughout the morning, not a bone was to be thrown to those of us who have concern. As a matter of fact, we were labeled, Arturo Morales labeled us as what? An elite group of Republicans, I think is how he put it. Really? That includes our former Congressman, Jim Hansen, who wrote an op-ed editorial piece on this. That would include our former governor, Mike Leavitt. That would include many former leaders of the GOP, including Joe Cannon. It would include myself, and you know how elite I am. And then it would include Kirk Jowers, the director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. It would include, LeVar Webb. It would include, so we now, by the extreme right of the party, have been labeled the elite of the party. And so not a bone was to be thrown. Not anything was given at this past convention for those 77% who felt, I guess we're all elite. All 77% of us are elite members of the party, right? Which means what? That there are 23% who, I guess, just have a much better grasp, minds immeasurably superior to the rest of us, who felt that, those wascally, pesky people who think maybe the caucus ought to be a little more inclusive, those who believe that maybe before you dodge a primary election, maybe you ought to have to hit a little higher bar than 60%. Maybe it ought to be 66 2/3. I guess those of us in that frame of mind, I guess we're just a bunch of elitists. I got this email this morning. Came to me from a delegate in Vernal, Utah. And Debbie, thank you, and said, I listened to your report this morning on Channel 5. We talked about this on KSL TV this morning. And she said, and I agree with you. As a state delegate, I was shocked that the ultra-conservative wing of the party is taking over. I might add, again. After the convention, I paraphrased to a friend that I didn't leave the Republican Party. The Republican Party left me. This deeply distresses me. I really had high hopes that maybe at least a little bone, and those of us who are, I guess, so elite, that's all we asked. Let's just figure out a way that we can make the caucus, not do away with it, just make it more inclusive. Give people a little more flexibility to participate in this tiny, tiny, tiny little sliver of time that has unprecedented power. And then at the convention, how about instead of 60, let's go 66 2/3. Not back to the 70 where we used to be, which made a lot of sense and worked very well for the Republican Party back in the day. Let's just go 66 2/3. But oh no, as I've said over and over, not a bone was to be thrown by those with minds immeasurably superior to the rest of us. The 77% who said, you know, this is kind of the least we can do. Interesting headlines over the weekend. This one, GOP vote delegates threshold just fine. This one, Utah GOP again rejects reforms to the nomination process. But I'll tell you, I just had to kick things off by, kicking back and getting one of my fellow Republican elitists on the line with me this morning. And Kirk, how you doing?
Hey, I'm great, Doug. How are you?
Well, good. I'm just quoting Arturo Morales as basically, hey, we have no reason for raising the threshold. The only reason we would is to meet the demands of an elite group of Republicans and some Democrats. So I decided I'd call one of my fellow elite Republicans. I'm really disappointed with what happened over the weekend. I mean, not a bone was thrown, Kirk.
No, and most people said that's what you would predict. There's not a lot of George Washingtons in the world, period. And you're really asking them to give up a little of their own power for the improvement of the public, and that's a tough call when it's your own power. And so I think we all thought this might happen, and especially when we saw that about 1,500 delegates were not there, and so you really have condensed into a very small group. BYU did some really interesting polling last week of caucus attendees, and had people who attended the caucuses been able to vote. It looked like it would have passed with somewhere between 77 and 83%. But, that's not who is there. It's the ones who were elected by those caucus attendees. So you really limited the number of people who were participating at that point.
It is interesting because you're referring to the statistics I have in my hand that says 77% favor or strongly favor a proposal to increase the proportion of delegates a candidate must win at the convention to 2/3 of the delegates. Now, that isn't going back to the old standard, which was 70%. This is going back to 66 2/3%, 2/3 of the delegates. And then you mentioned 83. And 83% disagree or strongly disagree that candidates should need to convince the most active party members in order to win the nomination. But that's exactly the situation we have right now. You mentioned this smaller group of people, and I don't quite know how to deal with this. Over the years, we've talked about this, Kirk. There are people, and I'm only half joking about this, who would miss their daughter's wedding or their mother's funeral in order to go to the caucus meeting, in order to vote somebody out or further a particular cause. And it really concerns me. And there was a great op-ed piece just a couple of weeks ago from our former Congressman Jim Hansen, who really argued for some reforms, really argued for some changes here. And he even pointed out in that op-ed piece, I don't have it here in front of me, so I can't quote it directly, but pointed out that some of his Republican friends had said, but Jim, you may have very well have won because of some of the standards and so on that were in place because of the caucus system. And Jim Hansen, to his everlasting credit, came back and said, that might be right, but it doesn't make it right. And then he went on to argue for the changes. But we got nothing. We got nothing.
We got nothing. And I thought it put a fine point to it because besides voting down any of these reforms that would get more people involved, the delegates also went very clearly against Republican voters' opinion on Utah Compact on immigration reform.
Yeah.
They went against Common Core, and they went against any type of compromise or nuanced position on health care reform. And so, no is the easiest answer, and they voted that on really all of these different issues.
I know Thomas Wright and Ivan Dubois and others really, at least on the surface, seem to be reaching out, trying to come to at least some kind of a compromise to keep Republicans together, to keep Republicans under the big tent or expand the tent, which has shrunk, in my humble opinion, dramatically over the last several years, and certainly since Ronald Reagan here in the state of Utah, and it just seemed to no avail at all. What kind of a situation is James Evans walking into?
James has got his hands full. He's a good guy. He's smart. I think he'll be able to walk that tightrope. And in some ways, it may just simply be beyond his control. Thomas and Ivan tried their best to make improvements. They had walked the walk as far as they could under our current system to increase participation, but they realized that it's a natural capping event when you only have 2,600 Democrat and now 4,000 Republicans, of which we saw 2,500 showed up. You can't increase participation at some point because that is the limit. And I think they realized that and thought there's got to be some ways that we can reform it and get more Utahns involved.
I'll tell you, the texts and the email that I'm receiving are just overwhelming with disappointment. This person said, I'm a Republican and a county delegate. I'm disgusted with the high-handed attitude of many. I will consider a Democrat as a protest vote in the next election. This person said so. The few, again, are leading the masses. This person said, the problem I have with the caucus system is there is no way a few appointed people can possibly convey all the opinions of the people of the district. And it just goes on and on. This person said the caucus system must go. It's time for a primary only. They want to take it even deeper steps that, certainly have been discussed. The caucus system gives only a few people the right to choose. If they voted the will of the people, it would be good, but often they don't. So I don't know what is fomenting out there and what is likely to happen now with, and I'll use Arturo Morales' term again, those elitists, that elite group of Republicans out there. What is likely to happen? Will the initiative, the ballot initiative, go forward now?
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that, Doug, because elitists can't get this done. The elitists have zero chance, and so it'll have to be a real grassroots effort that will take this mantle and try to get the people more public. That's what's happened in the other states. Every state had our system in 1890.
Yeah.
We're the only one who still has it. And other states have had to have this kind of moment where they realize, and your last text that you read was particularly astute, a lot of times, on a lot of issues, we've got the polling where our delegates are sometimes 30% away from Republican primary voters on issues. So it's not a republic. They're not representing a greater whole. They are representing a very, very narrow slice on many issues. And I've had a number of legislators, Republican legislators, who have said publicly, I obviously can't say anything about it because they are my kings. They can defeat me. But you have to get this passed because I cannot vote my conscience on education or immigration right now. And so for issues that matter to people, I think it's important. there are meetings going on today and tomorrow to try to assess the best way forward, proposals from within the party of what they'd like to do. And so